We are live.
Awesome. Well, welcome back to Coach's Corner, guys. So this week, burden was on me to come up with a topic, and I thought that it would be appropriate that we kind of just continue what we were talking about last week since we kind of cut a little bit short with time. And Brittany brought up a great subject of just kind of the general phases of movement. We were talking about concentric, isometric, and eccentric phases of movement, and how we kind of, each of us uses them differently, and how we use those with our clients and with ourselves and our own training programs. And what I think all of us kind of came into agreement kind of towards the end there in the general sense that the concentric phase is really popular. People focus on that, how much can you really pull up during that bicep curl, but people don't really focus on, holding the contraction in place, and then also that kind of going down the eccentric phase, kind of moving slow in the negative part of the movement. So I think what I want to start off with is a question for both you guys, because you guys are pretty, accomplished athletes. How do you guys use eccentrics and isometrics, if at all, in your current training programs?
Well, I guess I can start there. So, as an endurance athlete, it's basically everybody is trying to combat injury all the time. And that's one of the main reasons integrated strength training into an endurance program is so important. Other than developing coordination, be a more well-rounded athlete / human, and body composition. Injury prevention is definitely up there in priorities with strength training. So that being said, isometrics, planks, side planks, holding squats, wall squats, those are definitely tools that are used by most endurance athletes and their coaches who prescribe strength to develop core stability and stiffness, which is really important if you're biking or if you're swimming, especially, or if you're running, is to have that stiffness through your core so that you can resist rotation and not leak energy. So that's really important for isometrics. Eccentrics, I would say, play a similar role in injury prevention, especially in my own program, especially as single leg stuff comes to mind. So can you step back in a reverse lunge with as much control as possible? Working on deadlifts, doing the eccentric phase of the deadlift as much as you can. Those hamstring curls, those are really important movements. The direct application I can think of to my own training is, especially with trail running, is running downhill. And that is just the best way to build stamina and I guess resistance against injury, because you're making yourself very, very sore those first couple of times you do it. But then you become more physically resilient. The more you run downhill, your body learns to absorb the shock. Your joints adapt to absorb the shock. So that's a really important thing from just strength and injury prevention and athleticism that I use personally.
Awesome.
So my training is, I would say it's a lot different, but the focus here when I'm training is going to be different than an endurance focus. So as a bodybuilder, especially in the off season of a bodybuilder, the goal right now for me is to put on as much muscle as I can. So then that way, when I'm on stage the next time, I look different, I look better, and I focus on, the feedback that I get from the judges, right? So if right now, like when building more muscle and focusing on hypertrophy and strength, the eccentric portion comes in, it's the biggest focus is going to be the eccentric portion versus like isometrics. personally in my programs right now, I don't have any isometric movements. I know I use them, you know, when I'm programming for clients or when I'm programming a class, like we use like isometrics, like Brittany was saying, like planks, or, you know, just like holding a squat or holding like in the bottom of the squat or the top portion of like a bicep curl, something like that. But personally for me, the eccentric focus is going to be the biggest thing, because when you can control the weight going down or up, whichever movement you're doing that the eccentric portion is going to be the most beneficial for building muscle and gaining that hypertrophy. So, you know, right now, like my biggest, you know, feedback was like more delts, more chest, and like glutes basically. And with what Brittany said too, like eccentric hamstring curls, like that's the first thing that comes to mind. That's on my program. Like, you know, doing a hamstring curl and then letting that slowly fall back, like the hamstring focus, like that's going to help so much building up that backside for, you know, physique athletes. And also, you know, for more, you know, transferring to real life instead of just sport, that's going to help when, you know, if you are running or walking downhill, things like that, the eccentric portion of a hamstring curl is going to help. You know, eccentric squats, like really focusing on going nice and slow down in the squat is going to fire up those quads. And so, you know, again, like I'm not looking to build up my quads, but it is still a good thing to have for real life purposes. So that's kind of where like the eccentric plays a huge role in my personal training.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing. Yeah, I definitely want to touch on something I think that both of you just mentioned pertaining specifically to eccentrics, and isometrics also play a role in this too, but that would be kind of injury prevention and, you know, being able to function and do the kind of, you know, activities of daily life or whatever, you know, life demands of you at that moment without getting injured and trying to avoid that injury. I mean, when we see ACL tears, typically during deceleration or change of direction. And what the rehab for that after is a lot of isometrics and a lot of eccentrics, to retraining those muscles to be able to slow you down, you know, on the opposite, you know, in the negative part of a movement, essentially. And I like what, you know, Brittany mentioned, running downhill is a great one, especially for the quads. It's going to be all, you know, quads decelerating you 100% of the time. So stuff like that is super essential, as well as isometrics, I think, for rehabilitation and injury prevention, also known as kind of prehab, which is a popular term these days. That's super cool. I also want to kind of segue into another topic, and that is performance in young athletes, you know, using some of these strategies. And something that I learned a couple of years ago was a physiological phenomenon. You guys might be familiar with it, the post-action potentiation, which is basically the concept in which, you know, if we're performing heavy back squats, like a heavy compound movement with load, if we perform 8 to 10 with eccentrics and isometrics, we should be able to go out shortly thereafter and improve our long jump distance or long sprinting times and other stuff like that. So there's a big link in between heavy compound lifts using eccentrics and isometrics, and then right after the body getting kind of a boost in performance, so to say. That was super interesting to me. I started to implement that with football players that I worked with in the past. And to be honest, it's something that I never really thought would be, you know, something to do. If you're doing something really heavy, you're trying to go slow, you're trying to hold in a certain position. And then you ask, you know, your athlete, hey, let's go do some sprints right after. You would think that their legs would be kind of juiced up and not be ready to kind of take on that, for lack of a better term, task. So that was something super interesting to me. What do you guys think about that kind of stuff?
I know, like, this is similar to what we used to do in college, where, you know, for softball, every single game we play is a doubleheader. So we're playing, you know, 14 innings essentially in a very short period. And when we would work out, we would do, you know, the hardest things right before we would go into practice, because it would help you be able to build that resilience to be able to perform on the softball field in, game 2, inning 7, right? Like bottom of the 7th inning, you're super tired because you've played now, basically 2 full games. So if you can practice when you're already like fatigued like that, then when you come to the game time situation, your body is already used to being tired and performing, at its optimal level after you've already put it through a bunch of, exercises essentially. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of reminds me of that. I mean, I'm not saying like we would purposely like squat and then try and like sprint to first base right after. Like that wasn't really the intent there, but I can see that, being something to implement with athletes, because I know that if you train a certain way, like to fatigue yourself essentially, then you can perform better in the long run after being fatigued during a game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I kind of have 3 thoughts around that. First of all, super cool that youth athletics is starting to embrace strength training, because growing up, I did none of that. No strength training, maybe a little bit in college not college, high school for track, but definitely nothing growing up. I played soccer I started when I was 4 years old, dabbled in many sports, and did it at a pretty high level all the way up until college. And strength training was never part of the equation. It was only part of it because I did it myself because I liked it. So super cool that that's starting to be implemented by coaches in youth athletics, because I think that's setting these kids up for success, helping them grow bone density, neuromuscular patterning, just overall athleticism, especially for those athletes who unfortunately are specializing in one sport for their entire life, in search of scholarship. That's another discussion for another day. My second thought is that what you were talking about, Luis, makes sense, because it's neuromuscular priming is the fancy way of saying it, but we also see that in rehab situations, right, where you have somebody hold a single leg squat or hold a glute bridge until their muscles start firing, and then you have them go and do another task like bounding or skipping or jumping from side to side, something like that, because you're waking up those inactive muscles. So it makes, it's kind of counterintuitive, like you said, when you think about it on the surface, that you would think it would fatigue you, but it actually sets you up for success, because I guess it is recruiting all those muscles and getting things to work together and just working on overall coordination. So that was kind of my second thought there. My third thought was, I think that needs to be implemented into more training, and that's something we can definitely take into the weight room as coaches and with our own programs, is doing something, a compound lift, whatever it might be, and then going and doing a similar pattern, but maybe in more of a cardio or metabolic conditioning sense.
Yeah, definitely food for thought there. I think that we as kind of a collective are on the forefront of bringing this kind of training and this kind of science into the mainstream. I think that, we're still, I think for most youth athletes are still kind of maybe underserved or unaware, or, just this, like you said, the strength training is starting to kind of seep its way into youth sports. And I'm hoping that more, people like us are able to, as the years go on, provide more information and provide more options for people. Because I think that kind of the old school way to go about it is, we're just doing this, and this. Maybe we'll go do some running later, whatever. But it's very kind of cut and dry. It's very, old school. It's a little simple. And I think that even though, sometimes complexity breeds confusion with young athletes, getting them to learn this stuff at a young age will really help them, through their athletic careers and then beyond in their career of moving through life.
Mm-hmm. And maybe once again, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, Luis, from your original topic, and maybe this is something we can dive into in another day. But if we're speaking strictly about youth athletics, think about us growing up playing sports. Who was our coaches? It was someone's dad that had no qualifications, volunteered, had some job completely unrelated, probably maybe played the sport, maybe not, but maybe played it, and probably just regurgitated stuff that they had heard from their coaches, or that if they had no idea what they were doing, what other people told them they should do. So it's probably, in that case, it's probably better that we didn't have strength training, because might not have been done properly. But then we can also argue that maybe there's need for more regulations and certifications in youth sports, because it doesn't seem, even in high school, some of my coaches, I don't know if they should. They were good coaches, but I don't know if they had all the qualifications they should have had to coach at that level.
Yeah, that's actually the exact reason why I was brought on as a coach for the team I coach now, was because it's right in my wheelhouse, like strength training. I can give nutrition tips, all of that kind of thing, and they definitely, coaches are now, and parents now are starting to see a need for that for their kids, because they've gone through playing sports their life, and they're like, oh, I can't teach them, or I can't help them to be able to do that. And I went through a lot of injuries throughout my whole softball career, and I was at this point 21, 22 years old, and I'm like, my shoulder hurts all the time because no one ever taught me how to throw a softball properly, right? And it's like, why are these parents, we have someone that maybe played 10, 15 years ago, but now their daughter or their son wants to play softball, baseball, and they're like, oh, well, I think I remember how to do this from, again, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. But, sometimes things do change, and there are more efficient and better ways to move and perform as an athlete. And, it's definitely something I think that as an industry is starting to change, and that, people are starting to notice that, if you go to college and you're on a team, right, there's specific coaches for specific things. Like the head coach is not going to be teaching people how to strength train, because, the skills they don't coincide with each other. And I definitely, like, even, at the Division III level, we kind of had a little bit of that too, where my head coach didn't know anything about strength training. So we had, one of my assistant coaches was the one that would lead the workouts for us, because my coach had no idea what she was doing. Granted, that's also another whole story inside itself. But, I think people are starting to kind of notice that for the youth athletes as well, which is very, in my opinion, a very important thing to have for them.
Definitely. Yeah, the kids are the future. We're getting kind of close. I want to close it out just by almost circling back a little bit to just the concentrics, eccentrics, and isometrics real quick. And I might have mentioned this to you guys before, but something that I've implemented in my training since the beginning of this calendar year is an eccentric isometric strategy, if you will, where I'm spending about 2 to 7 seconds on the eccentric and 2 to 7 seconds in the isometric phase, and then 1 to 2 seconds with the concentric. And I just want to kind of, I guess, challenge you guys a little bit just to try it out with like a couple movements within your program, or just try it out, on a light training day, and just let me know how it goes for you, how it feels for you. For me, it's helped a lot with kind of joint health, and this kind of circles back to our volume conversation too. If you knock down the weight a little bit, it can have a tremendous effect on the strength of the joints themselves and the tendon tissue that holds our muscles to the bone. So that's just kind of something that I wanted to kind of close out with. Ask you guys, action item, try it out sometime. Let me know how it goes. We can maybe discuss it sometime. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that was a great discussion, and I think it also gave us a topic to talk about next week. Youth sports and all the kind of craziness around that. So I think it would be a lot of fun to dive into that topic next week, because I know both of you are Jazzy, you're currently coaching youth, and Luis, are you still coaching youth right now?
I'm currently not, just because of the whole situation with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Youth football in California has moved to the spring, so it's kind of still a TBD situation for me. But up until this year, I was.
Cool. Okay, cool. And I've coached youth soccer a little bit here and there. The 4 and 5 year olds, they're so much fun. But that beehive ball. But that could be a fun topic to dive into next week, because I know there's lots of opinions and lots of discussion out there. All right. Well, thanks everybody to joining in for Coach's Corner. Make sure you go back and rewatch some of our other videos. If you have no idea what we were talking about when we referenced last week's video, make sure you go back and watch that, because it's definitely the introduction to what isometrics and eccentrics and concentric contractions are. So we'll see you all next week.